embodied experience of pain, unease, and neglect of our survivors is our foremost attempt. So, Viram has initiated a discursive struggle where we aspire to create a language of protest against quotidian acts of neglect and violence. Hence the term Viram, which essentially denotes, a pause, a halt, where you recognize that for what it is. And while the manifest end of the spectrum of violence is something that is rightly deserving public outrage, in Viram, we urge you to look at the other end of the workings of low intensity violence and say that these too deserve your outrage. So in Viram, we're interested in what is, let's say, chutkan kam, a term that I came across when I was interacting with Divya. We're curious to know, why does a Ria to do not have time to feed her child, or for that matter, even herself? Why a Sunita maybe feels guilty for not attending to her families on days when she's out with her friends, that too rarely. We want to know, why is multitasking such a virtue, and why the right to rest and leisure is still a fiction. Moreover, we want to know, why is this me time so elusive despite, being its most ardent exponents. So I remember the entire segment of Vakt that we came up with, Katyayani and I, we came up with this theme, was because of the ethnographic, everyday ethnographies that we were conducting, the everyday conversations that we were having. And essentially, there was this one comment that kind of created that thought, where my help, basically, mentioned during one of her conversations, कि madam, मेरे पास तो मतलब मरने के लिए भी समय नहीं है. And this was a statement which was given very casually, but at the same time, it kind of got us thinking. What is this waqt? Why does it come with its gendered baggage? What is time poverty? What is trip chaining? We started to, do a bit of our own research, and we have our own dedicated group of, interns who are looking at and curating content related to time and trying to bring in those voices. So Viram and all our members essentially welcome you. Welcome the three of you researchers from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So we have amongst us senior researchers, and IIHS is a national education institution committed to the equitable, sustainable, and efficient transformations of Indian settlements. So we have with us Rashi Mehra, Divya Ravindranath, and Antara Rai Chaudhary with us. So I'll just be sharing a brief background about all of them, and after which I'll be handing it over to Katyayani. So Divya Ravindranath studies informal work, social protection, gender and urban health, and her work examines how women in the informal economy experience the mother-worker conundrum as they seek to balance paid work and childcare in the absence of maternity benefits. Her ongoing project looks at time use and breastfeeding practices at informal work sites. Antara's projects and studies look at conditions of work that are dominated by women in studies, especially the sector of domestic work. Her latest research looks at how different urban households organize their domestic work between paid and unpaid work in terms of both time and labor, and how it shapes the labor market for domestic workers. Rashi works on creating research on social movements to support the work of activists and practitioners who engage with marginalized urban geographies. She also works on an international labor organization supported study for understanding paid and unpaid domestic work in urban contexts in the cities of Bengaluru and Chennai. Rashi coordinates this amazing multi-stakeholder campaign as well called Main Bhi Delhi. And I'm sure a lot of our interns, a lot of us, our viewers must have gone through that. So I'm very happy to be welcoming the three of you. And Katyayani, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. As Priya mentioned, so time poverty is something, we have been trying to understand, trying to also understand solutions as well as responses to time poverty. In our last conversation we had on time poverty, we had Georgina Raghavan, who has an NGO in Mauritius, talk to us about time poverty. And something which came out of that conversation was a concept called time banking. And as a concept, it was something absolutely new to us. But as we delved deeper, as the two of us, also as a collective, we did understand that there are, of course, a lot of informal mechanisms that can actually be used to, try to end this sort of time poverty. But still, we came back to the first building block as to what is time poverty. Why are women really facing it? Why is it so gendered? And if at all we are able to remove the physical component of time poverty, as to women facing a crunch of time on account of the physical presence required at various places, can we really take away the mental load? Is it something, which is feasible, say in the next, in our lifetimes, or is it something, which we actually might not be ever able to take away? Because if we see across geographies, across economies, mental load is something women really battle with. And I've rarely found women who are actually able to break free from the shackles of not constantly planning in their head. Of course, as regards, the conversation we had with Divya and Rashi a week back, very enlightening conversation, which actually spurred a lot of our own thinking into very mundane acts, which we might treat them to be mundane, but are actually very significant if we look at them in terms of the time scale. Something, for example, as Divya will be talking to us about breastfeeding. I'll be admitting here that I was actually ignorant about the fact that if we look at exclusive breastfeeding for a year, which roughly amounts to probably 1,800 hours for a lady, and if we look at the man hours or the woman hours, she's putting in a job, that would roughly translate to 1,960 hours. So looking at the scale, looking at the fact that paid maternity leave is something not available to all of us as a right. And I would even go to the extent of saying that maternity leave is one aspect. Of course, all of us who have access to it, I'm sure we are all lucky to be having or privileged to be having access to paid maternity leave. But what about the mental load that comes along with paid maternity leave? I still feel it again remains a very intangible component, something which is not captured in any metric. So really looking forward to this discussion, learning more about it, and learning also how we as a collective, we as a collective in Viram, we as a collective in this nation, in this geography, on this continent, and even across the globe, can actually spur a discussion into finding a sustainable solution to time poverty. Even if one of our, we are able to contribute one idea to it, and probably, as we talked to you that day, even try to implement a pilot on ground. I think that would be something we're really looking forward to from this discussion. Thank you so much. Over to you, Divya.
So I think it's Antara who will be initiating the conversation right now. And what we're really interested in, Antara, is how we can sort of shift, of course, our conceptual gaze to the kind of ethnographic work that the three of you have done, and the rich data that you've brought to the fore, the conversations that you've had. So really looking forward to this. Antara, over to you.
Thank you, Priyadarshini and Katyayani. As just said, I work as a researcher with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. I'll give a brief outline of how we have planned to go ahead. We all will speak for about 15 minutes each from our experiences of what we refer to as time poverty in people, especially women's experiences within our research and practice. Sometimes it was done intentionally, and sometimes because it was just inescapable to the research question or the objective of the practice to come back to time and time poverty as a concept. So I'm here because I work with Divya and Rashi on projects that look at work that is dominated by women. And when they were asked to speak at this platform, they asked me to join in. I have spent some time in the last 5 years learning about women working in factories and industrial workshops that make steel utensils, in street vending, primarily selling vegetables near their neighborhood or near their house, in the home based work of various kinds of products, from seasonal decorations like toran and mats, reading strips of bindi and punching holes in a belt. Fairy work, that is a form of barter come hawking, for which women travel across the city, and most of all, domestic workers. And so I will speak from across these projects and from what I've learned from the experiences of these women and what they see as the important dimensions even within time poverty rather than going ahead with my sense of what time poverty is. As I said ahead, none of this work was designed to look at time and time poverty or even self neglect as a result of time poverty. But such is the nature of the experience of these women that these themes kept coming back again and again, and many a times even was the most predominant finding out of the entire research study. Can we switch to the next slide? Can we switch to the next slide, Ashi? So before I go into sharing some of the actual experiences and ethnographic material, I want to begin with sharing two things that help me anchor myself when I grapple with the phenomena of time poverty. One, there are too many tasks and there is too little time. This is something that a lot of us have felt many a times. But when we speak of time poverty in a sociological sense, it is the experience of having too many non discretionary tasks. That is, tasks that you cannot choose not to do, and you have too little time to do all of them. There can be a question to this whether this notion that you cannot choose not to do it is felt reality, a personal challenge, or a more objective reality, but we'll come to it later. And the second part is that in this sense, then it is not only a gendered phenomena that is experienced only by women, and it is also not experienced in the same way by all women. It has dimensions of domestic work and care work that have some similarities among women across classes. It also has dimensions of long hours of time required at paid and unpaid work, like travel and repair for subsistence of home, that have some similarities among men and women of oppressed socio-economic background, but not across classes. Thus, here are both similarities and dissimilarities in how time poverty manifests and what impositions it has on people. And I feel a discourse on it is enriched when we hold space for both of them. And I personally try to be aware of what intersections I'm reading when I'm reading about time poverty. And the third bit on it is that when we look at it sociologically, it also means that we connect our personal challenges constantly to larger social issues. And it is the task of research or even literature to distinguish between these two and keep finding links. This is extremely crucial when we have to think about what is to be done. On what aspects of these things do we have some personal influence, and for what we have to come together collectively. And it is not the responsibility of an individual to overcome the sense of time poverty. I will speak about the time poverty that is due to gendered allocation and unpaid housework and care work first. Now, unpaid housework is a central dimension of time poverty that is today well recognized. Priyadarshini already spoke about it. The Sustainable Development Goals speak of the need to recognize and value unpaid care work and housework to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. This inclusion is a result of sustained efforts by feminist scholars and activists who have been speaking of unpaid work for a while. This work has been falsely naturalized through gender roles that saw caring of children and elderly, domestic chores, and the social reproduction of the household not just as women's domains, but also an extension of their nature. Keeping such work beyond the production boundary further kept it outside of any economic planning and policy as well. Which just means the government does not has to care about how a household or how several thousands and millions of households will reproduce themselves. That's something that is naturalized in the organization of families. There are three aspects of within this that need recognition to see how it is so crucial to time poverty and why is it so central to time poverty. First, the time that it takes to do this task is not a little time. It's not a matter of 15 minutes or an hour. There is a recent survey by the National Sample Survey Organization, NSSO, in 2018 on the time use data of individuals, and it is an excellent source for someone who wants to understand in detail the distribution of unpaid care work and domestic work across households, across income categories, across castes in India. Last year, Rashi, Divya, and I have been part of a study at IIHS that looks at paid and unpaid housework in urban households. And what we see is that of the total housework, 75% of it was domestic services, which is cleaning, cooking, and such work. And 25% of it is what we, in our study, saw as a limited conception of caregiving services, where you look after a child or an elderly in the house. Further, what we see is that domestic services can take up to 7.95 hours, which is almost 8 hours of time per day per household in Bangalore, and up to 6.5 hours of time per household per day in Chennai. Further, what we find is that the time consuming activities not only take the largest share of time, they are most likely to be repeated every day. You cannot not do it every day, and it is undertaken by women. Which brings me to the second point, which is the task of unpaid housework and care work is often absolutely non discretionary for reproducing a household. Some degree of cleaning, organizing water and food for the house, cooking, mending children, constant caring for children and elderly, both in sickness and in health. These are all without question necessary. However, it still has to be backed by evidence time and again for some reason, and there have been several feminist scholars who have made the case for it as well through multiple lenses and frameworks, such as social reproduction, valuation through time use studies, its impact on overall macroeconomic health through resource misallocation, and that such maldistribution of human resources further reinforces patriarchal gender roles. Thirdly, presently, the way housework is organized in India and even care work is organized in India, all of these tasks are within the household and it is within the women in the households. Households that can afford to hire a domestic worker or a nurse or a nanny can outsource some of this work, but that section is a very small section in India. All of these conditions come together and create an environment where women find it impossible to escape the full burden of this work and find time for developing her own potential or joining paid work. Further, because the nature of some of these responsibilities requires her to be either close at home or at home most of the day, she finds it challenging to find work that can fit these parameters. There are several studies that show that these constraints on finding a job, that it has to have flexible hours or it has to have shorter hours, or it has to be closer to home, result in women losing their earnings or taking up jobs that pay lesser. And both of these leave her financially dependent or weak, which further affects her control over her decisions. There are again several studies that look at the imposition that time poverty has on one's health seeking behavior and health. Can we go to the next slide? The second aspect of time poverty that I want to speak about is the time poverty that is due to exploitative conditions of informal work itself. And this is where it's important to understand that it may not always be gendered and it may not always be about women, and to remember these intersections. I will not speak at length about it as we have limited time, but I would share only a few examples of working hours and its non-discretionary nature in informal work. A factory worker in Wazirpur industrial area in Delhi on a steel rolling machine was expected to work in 12-hour shifts with no breaks for a total of 7,000 to 8,500 rupees in 2016. The machine takes up a considerable time to heat up, and it was seen by the employer as unfeasible to shut it down any sooner than 12 hours. The Union of Garam Rolla workers managed to win breaks, but the length of the shift was the same the last time I was there in 2018. So one still has to be around the factory for 12 hours in a day. Once trained on this, the workers said they find it hard to transfer their skills to any other sector. A second example is of an occupation of fairywalas. These are women who barter new utensils for old clothes and fabric, and they sell these second-hand fabric to traders from across the country. They travel across the city between 6 to 12 hours, going from Raghubir Nagar to Gurgaon to even Greater Noida, creating a thriving recycling market but earning under 6,000 a month. Reflecting on this mismatch herself, a fairy wala in Delhi said, और काम तो है पर उसके लिए लागत होनी चाहिए. थोड़ा पढ़ लिख लेते तो मशीन पे काम कर सकते थे. Translating, there are a few other options here for work, but you need some savings to begin that kind of work. Or if I could, I would have worked on machines as well. Another said, if we get some work that is part time and home based, then we could look after our children better. But the only option for work here is of fairy. Both of them reiterating, like the steel rolling worker, the lack of options that they see for any other work given their community, their networks, and their skill sets. Women who do domestic work, which is seen as halka kaam for those who only see her for an hour or two at work at their own homes, forget that they work up to 8 to 12 hours to earn a decent monthly wage. To take another example, is gig work that is paid by task so that it is at your discretion, quote unquote, to choose your hours. But the payouts are so low today that one chooses to work for more than 8 hours for sure and often much longer. So the challenges of time poverty and the reasons for it cut across unpaid housework as well as several forms of informal work as well. And for a woman in this sector to create a situation that feels absolutely impossible to navigate. In this section, I will speak a little more about people's experiences, and I'll speak about it in English and not in Hindi, just because I think that will work for this audience. Now, I'll just say why we went and spoke to these people and how these sort of conversations emerge from it. So, for a study of gap in understanding how informal work was shaping health, my colleagues at IIHS crafted a study to explore what the conditions for childcare were among women and mothers who are working in informal economy. An intersection that has not gotten attention while shaping maternity and child benefit programs. As Katyayani already mentioned about the complications when it comes to having maternity benefits for informal workers. For this study, we met women in Delhi and Jaipur with children under 2 years who were working in some informal sector of work. And we asked these working mothers, are you able to feed your child as you'd like to? Before looking at more layered intersections of time and earnings and health and self neglect, I want to share some of the experiences directly of not finding enough time to do what they had to. I don't boil the water before feeding my child. If it is visibly unclean, then I will do it, of course. I just do not have the time to look after my child as I would like to. I don't have the time to make specific food preparations for my child or feed him over several short meals as they ask you to. He eats what we eat, just maybe with a little lesser spices. If I am having roti at 2, he will also have a roti at 2. I don't get to take a leave even when my child is sick. I hope to come back and see him in good health. I have to, this is from a ferry worker, I have to work, go long distances for hawking, and then I also must breastfeed my child. I don't think one can do all of this. I don't try to anymore. These conversations about directly about lack of time. Sure. These conversations at all, and not only about breastfeeding or childcare. फैक्ट्री में तो 1 घंटे का लंच ब्रेक भी मिलता है, पर हमारे काम में वो भी नहीं होता. आराम का टाइम नहीं मिलता, पूरा दिन लगे रहते हैं. And there are several such iterations of the same thing of just not finding any time to rest or to sleep through the day, that once the day begins at 5, it only ends at the night when everyone is asleep. But these conversations of not finding enough time to rest also kept going into conversations about the lack of choice about not doing one's housework. मैं एक दिन बैठ जाऊं तो दूसरे दिन सुबह चाय के लिए दूध भी नहीं होगा. Or of even not having a choice of not going for her paid work. So, what often one speaks about is that a woman is not at a discretion of not doing a housework. But what we often find when we keep speaking to women in informal work, that their paid employment is also not something that secondary breadwinner or a, a secondary earnings, but it is both for very stable and regular, unlike the house and that nature of income to meet their expenses. मुझे तो काम करना ही है, मेरी जिम्मेदारी है ये. Another street vendor in Jahangir Puri said, when we aren't working, the situation at the home becomes very dire for lack of money. So much so that we decide to go back to work within a few weeks of delivery. My husband cannot do the business of fairy and mandi by himself. One person's income is not enough, and that this work requires more people than one. Another woman from Jahangir Puri again says, हम जिम्मेदारी इसीलिए लेते हैं कि हमारी बच्चों की सुविधा मिल सके. आदमी के कमाई से पूरा नहीं होता. बच्चे को कोई चीज चाहिए पढ़ाई की, वो चिल्ला देता है. तो ऐसे ही काम शुरू किया था और बच्चे का खर्चा where this woman speaks about starting her work for her child, but eventually the entire responsibility for household earnings and for the child's earning comes on her. And this is something that we see across studies, that there is a feminization of this responsibility to earn for the household as well. And thus, the double burden of work that was for a long time seen as only for those who have to go and work is starting to become the norm, maybe. And in all of these interviews, what was neglected was the self, the time to eat properly, the time to rest, the time to have discretionary time of one's own to do something that wasn't part of one's role as a mother, as the primary caregiver of the household, as the woman who's looking over the household, or as a worker is just absolutely absent. Because that is the only part of her life where she doesn't have to answer someone if she doesn't do that work. And adapting to this reality, which of course everybody had to in their own ways to navigate this kind of impossible triad that there is, it had some unintentional impact as well, such as uh, but some of them navigated in a way that they changed their notion of what their primary responsibility is. So when a woman in Raghuveer Nagar says, when I can't handle the chores at home and my child simultaneously, I stop and I wait for my husband to come and relieve me of the child. And she feels no sense of guilt from taking this stance. And it is because it is we sense a community where all women work in fairy. So that identity of being a primary worker, that my work is extremely essential to who I am and to my household. So if I can manage that, that is most important, and everything else sort of falls after it, which sense was missing in the other sectors of work that we were in. Two other women speak about about how हमारे में बच्चे जल्दी समझदार हो जाते हैं. 5-6 साल के बच्चे भी रोटी खाना बना लेते हैं और खिला लेते हैं अपने भाई बहनों को. गरीब लोगों के बच्चे भी अपने आप समझदार बन जाते हैं. बच्चों को भी आदत बन जाती है कि माँ कहीं जाएगी और हम घर पे ही रहेंगे. There are also several women who kept saying that they are they do not, one of those statements were, जितना आलस करेंगे उतना तबीयत खराब हो जाएगा. And in many conversations, they kept coming back idea that you just have to be healthy enough to be able to go back to work and look after the home. And with this, I'll speak about the last section of what I want to talk about, which is reflecting on what is to be done once we know all of this. And thankfully, with a lot of people working on such themes today, we have a lot of knowledge around these concepts and phenomena and experiences. I because this is also a place of reflection, so I do not have the answers to any of it, but I will just be reflecting in this collective with all of you. The first thing I see is the need for a space of reflection and recognition of these personal challenges and social issues, and to hold space in these reflective spaces for challenges from all classes, which is something of what maybe Viraam is doing, or these conversations, but of a more informal nature where people can come in and speak about their personal challenges, but try to understand how they link to larger social issues. There's work from Simon Duncan and Rosalind Edwards who speak of gendered moral rationalities to describe how relationship between a motherhood and paid work is seen like. And frameworks like this sometimes really help one to make sense of what kind of negotiations they are in and what are their choices given the larger constraints. The three types of gendered moral rationalities that they speak of is of a primary mother, a primary worker, and a mother worker integral. Women with primary worker identities were most likely to talk about experiences, work, family conflicts, and experiencing guilt when their maternal responsibilities were sacrificed. And mother worker integral rationality would allow mothers to describe that their full time employment was a defining aspect of being a good mother, of providing for the child, and thus a negotiation between childcare and earning was, it would not result in guilt if she happened to neglect some of her expected childcare duties. There's also the work by Diana Elson, who speaks about recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work. In this, what she means by recognizing unpaid care and domestic work is to understand how this work underpins all economies and valuing it accordingly, which also means understanding what is most time consuming, how much it provides to your subsistence, and who does what and why. The second aspect of reducing it is about what can be delegated or eased with technology and better infrastructure, what can be reduced or avoided, what is conspicuous work in all of this. And the third aspect is of redistribution of what are the configurations of who does household work within the household, and what are the paid and unpaid configurations of household, whether some of it can be delegated not to a worker but let's say to a state, and if they are to be relegated to a worker, then how to create decent jobs. Which brings us to another point. When I keep thinking about what is to be done, is to think about what can we do about all the care work that has to be done anyway. Do we create more care jobs? That is what the International Labour Organization, the ILO strategy is, to address the question of unpaid work with creating new work at the same time in care jobs. But if doing so, what can be done about the devaluation of care work itself? How do we ensure that these new care works that are created are decent jobs and they do not reflect the kind of devaluation of care work that we see today? One possible answer is that there is a state led creation of care jobs that value labor time and care needs and not market value. and to reimagine that state doesn't have to work in the same logics as the market does. Paul Cockshott, he's a thinker and a scientist with socialist tendencies who believes in the planned economy for the masses as an alternative to present economic regimes as follows. There is also the oppression within a domestic economy, which by which he means a household here, and its diminished role in the productive economy. In the present mode of production, the production in the household has become much more restricted. It is confined to the final steps of food preparation, care of preschool infants, part of the care of school going children, cleaning and maintenance of domestic premises, and a part of the care for elderly. Over a period of time, several areas of production which were earlier within the household, such as cultivation of crops and food, clothing, child's education, have now been given out to the market. So, given this, at the same time, he suggests that, and not only he, but many, that if payment and thus value of work is not on the basis of its market value, that is, how can this act, this service, this good be exchanged for money, but in terms of labor time, then the devaluation of and oppression of women in the domestic economy could also shift for the better. But in the absence of such reorganization, we can at least expect the state policies towards care to show a different logic than a market logic. And the third is having decent working hours for all, no matter what. But to be honest, I don't know how this will work. And some of it sure sounds very difficult from where we are. But since this is a place of reflection, I felt comfortable sharing mine, what the questions I'm grappling with. And I try to remind myself that while more actionable and possible plans are put in place, no doubt, by all of us, the fundamental problems and the difficult resolution should not be forgotten, because we end up discovering them again and again and replicating this work of producing knowledge. But as we all, after all, have limited amount of time, we should be aware of all the knowledge that is already out there and try to think about what is to be done given all of this. And so I took a little more time than I expected.
I think next up we have Rashi. Is that right? So I think Rashi will be sharing with us the challenges on work-time balance for women in the informal sector, especially that comes with resettlement. So Rashi, really looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much. As Antra has spoken so wonderfully about, livelihoods and how they create so much time poverty in women's lives, I wanted to make a crucial link to housing to livelihoods. And I'm going to be speaking from my experiences of working in New Delhi and the resettlement policies that have sort of activated by the state, as we look at creating these were, during the Commonwealth Games, we want to showcase, our cities as world-class cities, and this notion that informal settlements or slums, as they are called, are sort of an impediment to that world-class city making. So the resettlement policies in New Delhi have shifted large populations from informal settlements that were more central in the city to the margins of the city. So we are part of a collective called Missing Basti, and I just want to show you a little map. So all the red dots, so we worked with activists and people who live in informal settlements and architects, etc. And we've come together and put out a website which you can access. It's called Missing Basti, and all the red dots that you see here was where the settlements used to be within the city, and all the yellow dots are where peripheral central locations of residents were moved on the outskirts of the city. So we've mapped about 280 evictions that have taken place in New Delhi from 1919 to 2020. And also, statistics like in the last decade, we've had the Delhi Development Authority has demolished more homes, about 7,000 more homes than it has built. So we're also looking at a paucity of economically affordable housing in cities, in Indian cities. One of our research in IHS also, we mapped all the land area that's under informal settlements, because the notion is that, you know, slums are suddenly taking over the city. There's a lot of squatting, you know, and this idea that, you know, that there's going to be like a planet of slums is literally how cities, especially of the global south, are being imagined and being spoken about. And so we mapped, my colleagues mapped the land area under every informal settlement in New Delhi. And we found out that only 0.6% of Delhi's land is under informal settlements. And then we took the land area for normal hatchback car, and we said, how much will a parked car, you know, how much land area does a parked car use? And multiplied by the number of cars that are registered to Delhi. And we found out that about 2% of Delhi's land is under parked cars. So there is also a question of, you know, when we are speaking about women, women's work, women's livelihoods, the deep connections that it has to housing. So when there is a movement to resettlement colonies that are 30 kilometers off the center, the impact on women's work. So I work closely with some of these women, and I can give you a few examples where a woman travels about 4 hours one way to do domestic work in more central locations because she was unable to find work anywhere near the resettlement colony that they were living in. I spoke to younger women who said they had to drop out of school because there were no schools planned when the resettlement happened. So Savda Ghevra was, you know, settled in 2006 as a run-up to the Commonwealth Games, which happened in 2020 in New Delhi. And it is only now that they finally got piped water. So we've essentially created, through policy and through a lack of imagination and lack of interconnections between people where people live and their livelihoods, we've created housing stock which is just not viable in our cities. So people over here really struggle. So you can imagine traveling 8 hours, 4 hours one way, and I have, you know, shadowed with my work. I've sort of traveled in buses with a lot of these women. So you go 4 hours one way, you work for 8-9 hours, and then you come back. And these are women who sometimes told me that they feel like they haven't slept in years. They feel like that they only can fall asleep when they're traveling. Sometimes they miss their stop, and, you know, and it's challenging. The metro has come finally to Savda, but again, it's not something that they can afford. So a lot of women still choose to go by buses because they're cheaper than the Delhi metro. So the idea of, you know, we have to kind of continuously look at, if we are saying we want more women to come into paid work, because we know that there is India's female labor force participation is incredibly low, only at about 16%, one of the lowest in developing nations around the world. If we say that, then when we look at spatialization or the geographies of where those jobs are, and then where are these women living, you know, it just, because even within that 16%, a lot of it is in the informal sector. So we are saying that there are lack of these regulations for a majority of women's work, and they just have to kind of deal with this kind of, you know, life where, imagine traveling that many hours just to get to work, then do very physically hard work, and then come back home. So it's just these imaginations that have to be rethought when we think about livelihoods, women's paid or unpaid care work, and also their homes. When we talk about homes, it's also important to understand if there are no basic services like piped water, which Savda now has after almost a decade and a half, or drainage, which they still don't have, or toilets, or anganwadis. If we don't have physical and social infrastructures in place, then the time poverty will only continue. Time poverty and economic poverty will continue to rise. It is to be able to curb that, we need to also look at ways to sort of mitigate some of these things by bringing in these social protection policies for these women in urban centers in India. And the connection that I found in my research between livelihoods and housing was, of course, transport. And I found out that women were choosing in Savda Ghevra to do night shifts because they said to me that they could leave by 5 p.m. when the sun was still out, and they could travel because they were, of course, very, very afraid at night to be able to travel out of Savda Ghevra and then come back early in the morning so that again there's sunlight. So you have women being pushed into taking up jobs that are functioning at night, so that they don't have to deal with coming home after dark in a place like Savda Ghevra. So just understanding how transportation and public transportation, which should be again affordable and viable, needs to come into resettlement colonies, especially if you're going to resettle people that far away. And this is a sort of a policy in almost every big city or smaller city in our country currently, where resettlement or the idea of building houses in urban margins or again in peripheries which are not connected, so to speak, from the center. So to just look at the linkages here. So I just want to think about, I want you to think about affordable housing. I want you to think about not just affordable, but viable housing. And when I say viable, is it close to a school? Is it close to a college? Is it close to centers where people can go and work? Is it close to, does it have then parks, etc., to talk about leisure? You know, so it's to, and then move certain in our citizens, moving them to places where then they have waited for years. Like I repeatedly go to Savda. I've been going there since 2008. Almost, I go back almost every year, and I'm told that, you know, finally we got a school. You know, finally there's going to be a police station here, and maybe they're going to remove the fatak. So there's a fatak, and the train goes in, and once the fatak goes down, you can spend 3 hours, up to 3 hours, just waiting for the fatak to open so that you can then reach the main road. Many women told me that they've delivered right there at the fatak. Many children of Savda Ghevra are born there, you know, just because we have not factored in some of these things. And we think that people exist in silos. You know, sometimes we fail to kind of understand that housing is linked to livelihoods, and the link between the two is public transport. So some of these things, when we are sort of thinking about, is how we also kind of strengthen some of these exercises. So in the master planning exercise, which Delhi is currently going through, where they're going to make the master plan for 2041 for the city. So for the next 20 years, the imaginations must enter the minds of urban planners, you know, and that's the thing. When we say that documents like urban planning or social protection policies are only going to be understood by very few people. So an urban planning is a very technocratic thing. We are only going to let, you know, architects and urban planners handle it. We're not in the city. Then how are those lived realities going to reflect in a master plan, and will it even work? Because not reaching their goals. So this is what I wanted to share from my experiences of working with activists on housing rights in Delhi and on evictions. So, you know, and I just want to end by saying that some of these women lived in places, if you're familiar, those of you who are familiar with Delhi, used to live very close to Khan Market. And I've had many women say to me that it used to be so nice to just be able to go and walk around in Khan Market. And now, like, I can't even imagine spending that much money or that much time going to my old favorite haunts, you know, in the city, and I'm stuck here. Or that people refuse to visit me. My relatives say, oh my God knows where you live. We are not going to come, and we won't be able to come and see you. It's too far away. So this disconnection completely from a social fabric of a city is also what deeply impacts women's idea of, you know, themselves and their dignity. So I just want to hand over to Divya, because we've been taking a lot of time. And I'm happy to share links of Missing Basti and Maybe Delhi, which is a campaign that we run. And you can read our research there. It's all open access. And yeah, and you can reach out to us if you have any specific questions. So, Divya?
Hi, how much time do I have? Just so that I know I can keep
Take
it.
your time, not a problem. I think 15 to 20 minutes, we should be fine, after which we'll have a round of question and answer.
Okay. Rashi, can you just share the PPT?
Yeah.
Okay, Rashi and Antara have really set the context quite well. So I'm just going to dive straight into the project that I've been working on and had to be stopped midway because of the pandemic, but hopefully we will pick it up very soon. So as Antara had pointed out, thinking about time has become really important part of the way we understand informal work and women's work in particular, because time constraints are both created by certain circumstances and also lead to certain circumstances, both of which have deep impact on the way women experience their everyday lives. So I'll just walk you through this project a little bit, tell you what it was about and how we went about it. All of it did seem very complicated, and even as we were doing field work, the methods had to be changed, had to be sort of played around with, because traditional methods of understanding time use weren't quite working here. So historically, time use has been used by feminist economists to be able to account for women's work in both the economy as well as in the economy, in the sense of the accounting systems, to understand where this unpaid work is being done, who is doing it, and if we actually did account for it, what would the country's economy look like, and what would the household economy look like, right? Right now, all the unpaid work that we do, whether it's cooking, looking after our children, cleaning, it's not monetized, and hence it's sort of assumed that somebody will pick it up. But in most households, it's the women who are picking it up. And what is the impact that it has on women's own lives, on their ability to work, to earn a livelihood, and so on. And these are conversations many of us do have in our own households. But here we are talking about it in the context of informal work in particular. Rashi, next slide. I think because of the pictures, maybe there's a slight lag in the slides also. So the research objective here was to understand how maternal time, that is in between paid and unpaid work, affected breastfeeding practices. But more importantly, there was also a practice objective. Very often we talk about the lack of time and the impact it has on childcare. But here I was working very closely with Ajivika Bureau, which is a not-for-profit organization based in Ahmedabad, and we were sort of grappling with this idea of how creches are sort of deemed as the best answer to all childcare problems. And yet, even with the presence of creches in a few construction sites, we realized women weren't able to breastfeed their children. In fact, the presence of creches meant women were not breastfeeding their children because they had a safe space to keep the child, but they would go away on work. Sometimes, it's a large construction project, so they are unable to come back and forth. And so all of these things impacted breastfeeding practices. And some of this was sort of based on my formative work, which was during my doctoral work, that I sort of realized that there were very high levels of maternal and child undernutrition. And, it was quite interesting that I started off studying child undernutrition. So there are very standard ways of studying it. And throughout my fieldwork, I kept thinking there's something more to the story that's beyond the numbers, that's beyond the measurements of height and weight, as we were talking to women. And so this is also in the context of women not having maternity benefits, not being able to take a break from work. We know women work very late into the pregnancy, as late as a day before childbirth. And also return to work within just a few weeks of childbirth, which has deep impact on their health and mental health as well as physical health. And throughout the fieldwork, women kept saying lack of time nahi hai, as one of the biggest reasons why they were not breastfeeding their children. And this sort of kept ringing, because all the time we would keep hearing women saying, I'm breastfeeding the child only twice a day, because there is no time. And so time became sort of the most important conversation that we were having throughout the fieldwork during my doctoral program. The next slide, please. Rashi, next slide.
I did it. Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
see
yeah,
it?
it's come. So also, I was looking at the literature on maternal time and breastfeeding, and it was quite interesting how I went to a conference, for instance, that looked at 1,000 days of childbirth and breastfeeding. It was a wonderful conference with people working in the sector of nutrition, public health, and so on, who went on and on about how 6 months exclusive breastfeeding was absolutely critical for the child's overall development and health. And everybody kept talking, there were these beautiful posters. It's used on every year. We have a week of breastfeeding that's celebrated. The government of India puts up these posters, NGOs put up these posters. So everywhere there's this talk about 6 months exclusive breastfeeding. And very interestingly, through those 3 days of the workshop, the conference, nobody once mentioned time. And I kept thinking, how do you think about breastfeeding without thinking about time? Because if there's one thing that a woman needs to have to be able to breastfeed a child, it's time. Especially in the first 6 months when the child is completely dependent on the mother for exclusive breastfeeding. More often than not, we don't have any other way of doing it, and the child is completely biologically dependent on the mother, and there is no other alternative than the mother actually taking care of the child, right? So these were these circumstances that we wanted to really study. But when you think about breastfeeding, it's both time intensive and it is also economically costly to women, because if they have to breastfeed, they have to take a break from time or slow down from their regular work, which has deep economic implications for the women's family. In some sense, then economic breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding is purely unsustainable, both for the family and the mother in particular. It was also interesting to see on the field that a lot of families did extended breastfeeding, so they fed more than 6 months than what sort of exclusive breastfeeding is mandated. But at the same time, it was inexclusive breastfeeding. So at the same time, the child was being fed other things simply because the woman couldn't, just focus on breastfeeding because of lack of time. Rashi, next slide, please. And then I started digging up literature to understand how, one understands exclusive breastfeeding. And it's quite fascinating to look at all these theories that were available in public health literature. Theory of planned behavior, self-efficacy framework. And I've just put out some main pointers here, and I'm happy to go back to them if anybody has questions. And it was quite interesting that none of these frameworks ever mentioned time. Though again, that seemed like the most important thing that a woman really required to be able to breastfeed her child. In the case of formal maternal employment in India, I must say that we have perhaps one of the most progressive, maternity protection norms. The kind of leave that is given in India, the kind of, daycare facilities that are available in some companies. But remember that over 95% of women work in the informal sector. So even though our laws suggest that there is enough scope for women to be able to, breastfeed their child, it really is available to a very small fraction of women that are working in this country. Next slide. So we had to sort of also think through what would be the methods that we would use to study this mother worker conundrum. Rashi, can you go on mute? Sorry, there's a feedback. And so there were three things that I was particularly interested in looking at: paid work, unpaid work, and what one would call as leisure or no work. And I'll say upfront that leisure was not something we were able to study, because in the hours that we were doing the research, there was no leisure. Women really rarely ever took, not rarely, never took a break. So there was always just paid and unpaid work that we were able to, sort of study. Next slide. Sorry about the lag. I think the pictures are. And so there were two ways of doing it. One was to think about recall, that what did you do in the last 24 hours, and the other one was to do it through shadowing, that wherein it's more sort of non-participant observation, sort of a little more ethnographic, where you follow the person that you whose time you want to study throughout the day. Now the interesting difference between the two is when you do recall, which is sort of a standard globally used, it's very difficult to sort of capture multiplicity of tasks, because very often women will tell you, yes, I cooked from time, say from 11 to 12 in the afternoon, I cooked. But when they do recall, they don't also tell you that as I was cooking, I was also looking after my baby, and I was minding a second child. And at the same time, when somebody rang the doorbell, I went to open the door. So there are all these tasks that women are doing simultaneously. And in our study, we were able to, in fact, spot about 6 to 7 tasks that are being done simultaneously. And breastfeeding was often one among them. And breastfeeding rarely ever featured as one of the tasks that they were doing. In fact, no woman, when we tried the recall, no woman reported breastfeeding as a task, because it was sort of so, taken for granted that it would happen on the side when she was doing other things. And so we also thought methodologically, perhaps shadowing was a more useful way to do it. And I'll talk about the ethical implications of this a little towards the end, because it is a big problem when you sort of think about shadowing as a methodological tool to understand somebody's time use. Next slide. So just to give you a sample of how the two different methods work. So if you look at recall, it's just between 30 minutes time distance and women are able to tell you what they were doing. But if you look at it, there isn't actually the capturing of multiplicity of tasks or even the complexity of tasks. Whereas in shadowing, we were able to get minute by minute account of what women were doing, how time was being spent, things like she breastfeeds the child in between the time that the lift takes to go up with all the cement or bricks, and the time that takes to come down. In that 7 minutes is when she's breastfeeding the child. So that kind of detailing we were able to do when we use shadowing as a method. Next slide. And then we sort of understood that when we talk about women's time, we also need to, and here the focus was exclusive breastfeeding, but we also need to talk about all the other things that happen in a woman's life in a single day to be able to talk about time poverty. So if you think about, what is the nature of work that women are doing, what are the rules of the work site, right? Some of these things importantly impact women's time. So let me give you an example that I was sharing with Priyadarshini and Katyani the other day. The way women's work is treated at the construction site, it is seen as small work or miscellaneous work, what is called as chutak kam in Gujarati, for example, right? Now it's interesting because even if she's carrying a 50 kg cement bag on her head and transporting it from place A to place B on the construction site, it's still called chutak kam. And because it's called chutak kam, the wages are accordingly, pegged at that kind of work, right? So it's unskilled work, it's work that is informal, and so you can only demand a certain kind of wages for it. And once that wage rate is so low, the woman has to do that work for a much longer period to be able to earn enough money. So it's very interesting how the site rule or the site's understanding of what women's work is actually impacts the way she uses her time through the day. And so this relationship between women's time has not been something esoteric or sort of something that we experience in abstract, but something that is directly related to both her wage and the kind of work she's doing. So women who are doing piece rate work, for example, have to do so much more work to be able to earn the same wages they would earn by a daily wage rate, right? So both the nature of work and the wage impacts it deeply. Similarly, site rules. There are some sites that won't allow you to carry your child to the workplace. You have to keep the child at the creche. In that case, the woman has to go back and forth, but there's no break in between, no official break for her to be able to go and breastfeed her child. That's one problem. But when the child is with her at the construction site, it's extremely dangerous because of falling objects, the pollution that is around with cement and dust and the heat and all of those other things. So the site in some sense has a direct impact on the manner in which the mother breastfeeds her child. Similarly, if we thought about childcare arrangements, we know that older children play a big role in facilitating mothers' ability to breastfeed their children. Here we also saw how the child automatically became a part of the work regime, especially in piece rate, so that they could help the mother finish work faster and then she could tend to the younger baby. And we need to think about that as how the family is using its time also in that sense to be able to understand women's time poverty. So older women played a big role. The availability of creche at the site, played a big role, and the environment at the site also had a big role in the way the women were being able to breastfeed their children. When we also think about childcare arrangements, it's quite interesting that we often think about it being an older sibling, mostly girl. But at the site, we also noticed it was not just about caring for the child, but specifically really important even for breastfeeding. In the time that the mother is working, the child is being held by this older sibling, and the minute the mother gets a small break, the older sibling runs with the child to the mother. She finishes breastfeeding as she's walking, with the head load. And the minute she sort of throws what's in that head load down into a lift or something like that, before she does that, she hands over the baby back to the child. So there was this sort of constant work that the older child was doing to support the mother. So when we think about time poverty, we also need to think about it in connection to the family family as a unit and how that impacts breastfeeding in some sense. Things that we were not able to capture but are really critical for our understanding of time use is other maternal factors like the physical health of the mother, the psychological health of the mother. Of course, it requires very different tools and we weren't equipped at that point to think about them. But this is something I would like to focus on in the future. The other thing that Rashi had already spoken about, so I won't focus too much on it, is to think about access to other services. The amount of time women spend in just gathering water, firewood, or even accessing sanitation facilities have direct impact on her time, but also on her ability to care for the child. Next slide, please. So similarly, when we talk about when we talk about the nature of work, I just wanted to put out a few pictures to show you what the site looks like. So if you can see the first picture on the top, a woman carrying a cement bag of 50 kgs, which is chutak kam or small work, though it's physically extremely arduous. It has huge impact on her body over a period of time, and also reduces her ability to earn wages in the long run. If you can see the second picture on the right, the kind of lack of safety equipment, the kind of environment that they work in, and have the child with them on the side. And the last two pictures at the bottom show us how women work in groups. So on the left at the bottom is something called as jodi ka kaam, where an husband and wife work together. And so if she takes a break for breastfeeding, it impacts the man's work and hence both their wages. Which is why women don't take a break to breastfeed their child, because they have to just keep going to be able to earn the day's minimum wages as a couple. And when we say jodi ka kaam, very often they're thought of as a family unit that is earning together. And as you can see, women are rarely acknowledged in the construction sector. So man at work, caution, because women aren't supposed to be in this masculinized, this very all over the country. You will see a lot of women, which is also very peculiar, I think, to India and South Asia, where you'll see a lot of women actually engaged in the labor work at construction sites. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry about that. I've already spoken about it, so maybe the next slide again.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just wind up here. Just I wanted to quickly talk about the methodological challenges and the ethical dilemmas while studying time use through shadowing, because there are other traditional methods. As I said, one could do a recall, one could do a diary method, but in a low literacy population, diary method doesn't work, and recall didn't work. While we checked a couple of times. So I just wanted to quickly run through what kind of challenges you face. As researchers, we are so sort of tied by the idea of the methodological sanctity of a project, right? You want to be methodologically accurate. You want to make sure that your sample is chosen carefully, that your method sort of follows all the rules of the method to be able to document time. And yet we found ourselves breaking these rules over and over again. Because with something like shadowing, you are getting into a very private space, and there are questions of confidentiality, privacy of the person that you're shadowing. And so we were very clear when we started the project that we would shadow only as far as we were able to. So with some women, we were able to shadow for 8 hours. With some women, we were able to shadow only for 2 hours. And we were okay with that, because the point of the project was to understand all the challenges that women were encountering while doing different types of tasks and childcare. And in some sense, the restrictions that we encountered, or the constraints that we encountered in shadowing, were sort of the reality of the site that we wanted to study anyways. So a contractor telling us you can't follow her anymore, or the woman herself telling us that, I'm done, you don't need to follow me anymore. Or her husband telling us we can't follow her anymore. All of these were quite indicative of the way the site operates anyways. And so in that sense, we decided to be really flexible with the method. And though we focused really on the details, thick descriptions, we also made sure that at no point we shadowed a woman who was uncomfortable or unable to have us around. Thanks to the NGO collaboration, where they had very clearly defined the format, and we were able to sort of have that open conversation right at the beginning of the study, that this is the format and this is the implication and this is the reason we are doing it, and so on and so forth, which helped us to sort of be very clear on what the goals of the study was. Just sort of to close, very often when we think about consent, we think about the participants' consent, and that's what our ethics boards require us to do. But through this study, we also realized that in an informal work site, consent really isn't about an individual. It is also about the site of work and the place where work is taking place, right? You're taking consent from the contractor, from the site inspector, from the security guard. So it's a really complicated process in some sense to do this kind of study, especially when construction sites are so guarded, they're so sort of closed off. You really don't know what's going on behind those large sheets that they put to protect, their site. And so it was quite an interesting experiment in that sense to do the study. And academically, perhaps we are falling short of the methodological detailing. But I think in terms of practice, it was a really important exercise for us to understand where women were spending their time and what circumstances were sort of adding to time poverty that the women were so strongly sort of experiencing in their everyday lives. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Divya. That was beautiful. And especially sharing your research methodology is something that, it kind of give us a sneak peek into the way in which you've conducted research. So for me, let's say three takeaways immediately would be that, of course, you've been analyzing how time poverty is matched by a very obdurate and an objective social reality. So that's the number one takeaway for me. The second takeaway is, of course, that dominant discourse has, neglected this aspect. Some of our government intervention programs, the nutrition program that you were talking about, it does not recognize the role of women as, economic workers in their economic role. So I think that's a very important aspect that needs to be taken cognizance of. Also, let's say where policy is slightly sensitive towards this, it is often unable to anticipate the unintended consequences. I think that's another aspect that you mentioned, the idea of having a creche facility. I mean, who would think that it would actually lead to lead to breastfeeding practices coming down? So I think being a little bit more cognizant about the second order effects is also important. And then, of course, as beautifully, Rashi spoke about how physical infrastructure, social infrastructure in terms of social protection policies, cultural recognition, what Antara spoke about, and of course, informed legislation. I think these are the various aspects that all of you in your talk have touched upon. So now, without taking any more time, I'd request, people who've joined us, our audience, our viewers, who are not necessarily within the network of Viraam, they're not functioning as interns, but let's say viewers who've joined from outside, we'd love to have your questions, please. So to all of them.
So, as an assignment under livelihood work, women work and livelihood, I conducted a very small time use survey on 5 samples, and I included homemakers and the bachelors who are living outside and conducting double burden at the same time. So in the whole prospects, I just realized that while talking to them, that there were two takeaways basically. That firstly, obviously, that the women who did paid work, they had to come back home from work and share the household duties, where on the other hand, the men just had to do the paid activities, and they did not consider the household activities because they did not invest any time, hardly if I take an average, it was just 90 minutes of the whole day. So basically, my question revolves around that. As we were talking about poverty, I was just asking that how can we reduce it, and relating it with the ongoing debate of monetizing the unpaid domestic work, because I believe that we have this code of conduct for the employees working, or the paid employees, that you get the sick leave, and you also get the weekends off. But how can we accommodate that in the policy formulation, while like how domestic workers, even if they are getting paid, how do we get this data or accuracy that okay, they should be provided with this hours of leisure time and everything. And also lastly, I have observed that while I was talking to or conversing with the homemakers, I realized that when I talked about them, I asked about them leisure time, they couldn't differentiate between the leisure time, the me time, and the time they invested in the domestic duties, because basically the whole day, the 24-hour revolved around the household activities. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Rashi, Divya, would you like to take it up? Any one of you?
I mean, your observation is bang on. I don't have anything to say to it, because it's very difficult to sort of think about how do we account for leisure time, right? it's a luxury in some sense, and it need not be. And yet, leisure is sort of absent in in many women's lives, and and so I think one of the things that the feminist economists, when they set out to understand time use, was to look at how we could look at all of these different tasks that women were doing, and leisure in fact is a quite an interesting thing because it is unsubstitutable task, right? So paid work is market work, unpaid work is where it could still be work that you could substitute for if you had the resources. But leisure time is literally about your own recuperation, your own ability to bring your body and mind together to be able to recover from the day's activities so that you can continue to do other things. And yet it is the most absent thing in our lives. And I think it's even in households with resources, you will often find women not experiencing leisure. It's I, and I think in many of our families, women often will tell you, I can't sit idle. I can't. I mean, my mother says this very often. I need to do something. I can't just like sit idle, right? Because leisure is not considered to be a part of our lives at all. And I think that is something the time use format really helps you to capture about how little we think about leisure in our everyday lives.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, it is also, I mean, if you already know about the work or about the book, it's called Why Loiter, right? So I don't know if you've heard about it, but I encourage you to go and read it. It's about just women in public spaces and
Exactly.
just making their presence felt. Because if you see women, when we are in public spaces, we usually have a mandate. We'll say we'll go from point A to B. This is the public transport I'm going to use. This is the time that it's going to take. I can't go at night. I can't go at whatever time. So I think that these are also, it is about looking at the built form of our cities and our social cultural practices that don't allow for that kind of rest. So imagine being in public spaces. So if you're a domestic worker, you're working in multiple people's homes, but can you then just sit in a park and relax for half an hour? We found in our research on domestic workers that there aren't places where women can just sit and eat. Domestic workers can sit and eat or have access to toilets and things like that. So I think that these are just connecting larger questions into, what is the built form of our cities, because the three of us particularly look at urban centers, and how that can be promoted. So yeah, definitely something to
I'm so
think
glad,
about.
Raj, you've raised this because we were exploring a chapter called Sthan on Viram, where we were looking essentially into built spaces and sometimes the hidden biases that are built into these very spaces. So we spoke about the public environment, we spoke about public transport, in fact, and we spoke about urban spaces to a great extent. So I'm grateful that you're able to sort of connect the dots for us as well. So we had Kabir Vajpayee and we had Preeti Vajpayee, and they've been doing some phenomenal work in Rajasthan and with the UNICEF, constructing gender responsive urinals, and they've also done a lot of work on the Delhi metro. So it's I'm glad that we're kind of revisiting that conversation as well, and we'd like to even talk to you further about how we can kind of maybe, let's say, have a panel related to space as well as time, kind of connecting various such issues together. All right, Sumedha has a question. So, Sumedha, would you like to, read out your question, or would you like me to do it? All right, Antara, I think, is already replied, but I'll just read it out nevertheless. So, Sumedha's question is, how has the analysis of time from a gendered perspective changed due to COVID-19? And what does it mean to go further from here? So, did COVID 19 bring to the fore certain other aspects of time constraint, time pressure, and time poverty? So, I think Antara has replied to that. Antara, would you like to say something at all?
Yeah, what I personally feel about the time is that it hasn't changed the analysis of time as much. There was a lot of work that was going on, but what it has done is that it has brought a lot of it to the fore because people felt the time in a very different manner. They felt housework in a different manner. They felt what it means to not have that kind of travel time that we used to spend going back and forth, what leisure can do to our minds, both in good ways and bad ways. So I think it is more about an opportunity opportunity to use that attention that people are giving to time and time in housework both, rather than changing substantially how the analysis is done.
Right. My question to the three of you, so where do you feel we can tinker? Let's say, in case we want to create better awareness, we want to bring in certain changes at the granular level in terms of work and labor conditions. Would you have anything in mind that we could really consider at, let's say, the local level when it comes to the administration, at the block level or the subdivisional level or the gram panchayat level? Do you have any ideas which we can kind of start, executing as, administrators as well? Do you have any message?
I can start. So, I want to just sort of say it out, put it out there that our study mostly has been in the context of maternity benefits and looking at time poverty in the context of informal work. And so perhaps we are emphasizing a little more on the conundrum that women face, women as workers and women as mothers, and how that relationship is really fraught with all kinds of challenges, right? But I also want to say, even if we weren't talking about the maternal pressure, if one is to talk about maternity benefits, and of course there is the maternity benefits program that India has for women in informal work, so which allows for some kind of compensation for the wage loss that they experience during childbirth. But it's 6,000 rupees for 6 months, and a woman's minimum wages would go up to 9,000 in a month. So she's not going to take the maternity benefits when it is so low and so difficult to access through the paperwork and the conditionalities that it imposes. So that's one part of it. But the second part of it is also to be able to think about all the other policies and programs, and perhaps Antara has thought about it a little more. And Antara, please feel free to add. But there are sort of other ways in imagining what time use means within a household. If a household were to be reproduced, like it was said before, what would it take for if you counted the hours, it would be more than 100 hours, right? Like the number of hours you need to just maintain and sort of push a household forward to be able to make sure everybody gets their nutrition, rest, sleep, all the work is done in the house so that they can get back to work the next day. So we have to think about all of these things when we talk about time poverty. It is not, as I said before, it's not an abstract concept, but something that we experience every single day. And so in terms of policies, one is to think about the woman as the mother and worker, but also to be able to separate that and say, if we also just sort of thought about all the family members, what is the part that the state can play, for instance, in sort of reducing the challenges that households are experiencing. So I think the state has, through its policies and programs, like just the functioning of an Anganwadi for longer hours can enable women to get back to the workforce, right? So all of these small things that don't seem connected to women's time but are intrinsically connected to women's time. We need to start looking at all of them together. We need to start looking at labor laws together with women and child development. They aren't separate in some sense, right? And yet they are very siloed in the way they are sort of thought of and operationalized.
So, a bulk of the work that happens in the GP and the block level, Divya, it's a lot of it is being performed by Anganwadi workers, ASHA workers, as frontline health workers, and even self-help groups. So I'll tell you about this interesting initiative that we're coming up with in the state of West Bengal. This is Project Uniform, where we're delegating the work of, preparing uniforms, making uniforms, stitching, cutting, tailoring by self-help groups. And I've interacted with quite a few of these women, and they are very comfortable taking these pieces of cut cloth to their homes and working within their homesteads, essentially, rather than coming to a space of work, because it kind of allows them the flexibility. So some of the things that you're talking about, they're very real. These are not fictitious. They have a very strong basis in reality. But what's also very difficult is for us as the administration and for the state, a lot of this work is being performed by them. And it's very difficult to kind of compensate them for the number of hours that they're performing. And so we really need to think through and come up with certain, incentives, maybe even social, cultural incentives that recognize their work, because a lot of things are being just added on to their already existing list, which is very onerous, essentially. So very difficult to kind of reduce the labor. But I think this gives a lot of us, some food for thought to kind of at least create those changes at our own level. So thank you. Do we
Yes,
have any questions?
I'd also like to quickly add that, when we think
Yes.
about substitutable kinds of work, so
Yes.
one is, we also need to think about the conditions of work and the wages that are demarcated for this kind of work. So the ASHA worker is a classic example today where literally any work that needs to be done is being done.
To quickly add that we've got some research on home-based workers, which is what you're saying the Project Uniform would do,
Right.
and one of the things that we are suggesting, because we also looked at women's homes, so the site itself, a lot of home-based workers, especially on the urban margins, because that's where they can do it, where they can sit at home and they can do a lot of this work. They don't have space to keep the stuff. And a lot of that also acts in. So one of the recommendations that we given to the DDA for the master plan was to start looking at social infrastructures, adding an economic lens to the social infrastructure that's being built. So we are saying that if you have a Bharat Ghar, or if you have an Anganwadi center that only runs from a particular time to a particular time, then look at it also its economic functions, and allow women who are home-based workers to maybe go there to store either the material that they're creating, or to go and sit there and work, because sometimes also being constrained to home can have its own mental impact. I mean, we've all suffered during Corona. So, some of these elements are something that home workers, when we speak to them, is what they've kind of, gotten back to us about that. The thing at the block level and at much smaller level, it's always great, because I think that to work at a neighborhood level or smaller clusters, I think that it will be great to be able to first do an analysis of who lives there and what are their challenges, and after that, I would really say that participatory forms of planning, getting people to come up with recommendations and solutions, can be really enlightening. I mean, we've been able to look at this idea of looking at an economic function of, and Bharat Ghar didn't come from me, it came from a woman who lives there and says, there's such a giant building, I wish I could have used it and stacked some of my stuff there. So I think that would be something that would be great, specifically looking at women, I would say forms of gender.
I am also been grappling with of how can it actually be.
Right. Thank you so much, Andhara. I think I'll just hand it over to Katyayani now. Katyayani, in case there's any question that you have from your end and the wrapping up, please make it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Divya, Rashi, and Antara, for a very, very invigorating conversation. One of the takeaways, as Priya mentioned, apart from those for me, also is that how time poverty is actually, is across genders. So, restricting time poverty, or the notion of time poverty only to the female gender, I understand would be a mistake, because of course the contours of time poverty might be different. So of course a large chunk of the male population might be facing a time poverty due to the paid work, and here we are essentially looking at unpaid care work, and also in the realm of the mental load, which might not be possible. I mean, which might not be present there for the males. But to restrict time poverty to just the females would be a mistake. So yes, I think from now on we'll definitely be more mindful of how we look at time poverty. And thank you for the suggestions as well. I hope that we are able to, as a collective, to collaborate more with you in the coming months, and to, of course, definitely find some solutions, or of course also tweaking the concept of time banking, as I and Priya understand. So looking forward to your contributions on the same, and thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you so much to all the participants for actually enriching us so much during this conversation. Thank you, and have a really good Saturday evening, you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Katyayani and
Thank
Kedar.
you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thanks. Yeah.